In 1933, the year I turned 9 years old, Hitler swore in his first personal guard unit, the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. This swearing-in was the forerunner of the oath of allegiance sworn by every man and boy inducted in the German armed forces. I swear to you, Adolf Hitler, as Führer and Reich Chancellor, loyalty and bravery. I vow to you, and those you have appointed to command me, obedience unto death. So help me God. By 1939, Germany formed an alliance with Italy called Axis Berlin-Rome. The following year, Hitler and Italy's Mussolini concluded a tripartite pact with Japan. Opposing this triumvirate were the Allies, consisting of England, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States of America. By 1942, the German army drafted all the boys in my age group. I ended up as a private in the Afrika Korps, one of Germany's elite military units. They used me as a replacement and shipped me to Tunisia, Africa, to fight the Allies. 1943. The smell of budding spring in Tunisia's Atlas Mountains teased my nostrils even as the ground vibrated like an earthquake under me. Hundreds of Sherman tanks rolled toward us. The Americans had us under attack. Within seconds, noise like metallic thunder shook our foxhole. "Come on, boys, come on out!" an American yelled from a tank rumbling close to my foxhole. I flattened my nose into the dirt. I thanked God that even in our haste, my buddy Klaus and I had burrowed deep into the rolling, semi-arid terrain of the Atlas foothills. "They want us to come out, to surrender," I said, quickly translating the English for Klaus. I could barely make out his face through the dust, although I was close enough to smell his breath. "What should we do?" I asked him. This was more than a rhetorical question. The word was, if you didn't fight, or worse, deserted, your own officers would shoot you without question, without thought. A private first class, Klaus outranked me. I thought he would know what to do. In my mind, he was an old guy, at least 30. I was a scared kid of 18. He should take responsibility. Klaus seemed oblivious to this logic. "Klaus, see what's going on," I said, nudging him again. By this time I had to shout to be heard over the mechanical monsters roaring above us. His blue eyes widened in terror in his dirt-caked face. "Are you crazy? I'm married. I've got 2 kids," he said. "Why don't you take a look?" "Because I'm the brains of this team. I'm not doing it either," I said. I wasn't going to stick my head out and get shot. Of course the Americans wanted us to surrender, but who knew what they had up their sleeves? Klaus and I hunkered even lower, crouched together at the bottom of the hole under a blanket of dirt. The shrieks and grinds of the tanks battered my eardrums. The sides of the foxhole vibrated like the skin of a kettle drum. I pressed my hands over my ears to shut out the noise and the reality above me. Men killing, men dying. Finally, the clamour of the tanks faded. Shots and shrieks replaced the metallic horror. I lifted my head just enough to see. A dust fog covered the ground and allowed faint sunlight to penetrate the field of death. Several feet away, over the edge of the next foxhole, a couple of dirt-covered guys, their eyes wide, stared back at me. I was incredulous. They were alive. I was alive. The dust drifted to earth. Sweat and tears stung my eyes. I blinked furiously to clear my vision. In the distance, the entire Allied force disappeared in a storm of dirt. I pressed my ears to stop the ringing. "They must have thought they wiped us all out," I yelled to Klaus. "How many are left?" a voice called out. "I'm here," the soldier across from me shouted. "2 here," I responded. I spat the dirt of Africa out of my mouth. One by one, other voices echoed across the earth in the now silent foothills. As impossible as it seemed, the enemy had overlooked us. All of the survivors had a story to tell about their close calls. Most of our unit was captured or killed by the enemy. From our straggly band, I found out that a few of our group had fought back out of duty. The Shermans crushed most of them right in their foxholes. The rest had been rounded up and taken away. Klaus and I soon figured out that if our full infantry unit had resisted, the Americans would have taken the time to mop us up. Sweaty, grimy and tattered, but basically uninjured, several dozen of us gathered together. We knew that the British and the Americans were somewhere around us. Our supplies, including food and gas, had run out. Our cause seemed nearly lost. There was also another factor to consider. Instead of "we'll fight to the last man," the edict drummed into us grunts from the very beginning. The attitude had changed. Our remaining officers seemed more concerned about saving our lives, if possible. I didn't know it at the time, but the change had come from the top. In the bitter 11th hour of the war, Hitler had sent a stark order to our Colonel General Jürgen von Arnim. "The German people expect you to fight to the last bullet." Von Arnim put his own spin on that order. He told his officers, "The last bullet shall be the last shell fired by the last tank. Then we will destroy our weapons, and Army Group Africa will give up." Our little band of survivors pulled itself together. An NCO, non-commissioned officer, took the lead. We wanted to find a way to the coast. There, if luck was kind, we could make our way to Italy by commandeering boats or planes. Little did we know that thousands of our fellow Axis troops had thrown down their weapons and were streaming toward Cape Bon on the Mediterranean, in a spontaneous, leaderless procession 80 miles long. There's an old proverb, "Man thinks, God laughs." Our plans now seem foolish, but at the time we stragglers had no options other than to fight or to surrender. But surrender to what? That we didn't know. We waited for darkness and headed north through cactus-covered foothills. Our bedraggled troop followed a railway track in the hope that we could avoid the cactus thorns and poisonous scorpion bites that had plagued us. We couldn't stop or rest. Come daylight, we would be vulnerable. Out in the open, we'd be targets for the next attack or strafed by Allied planes. American air power had grown more awesome every day with the virtual disappearance of the German Luftwaffe from African skies. Low-flying, strafing American P-38 and P-40 fighter planes with cannons routinely attacked. We were told we had a new weapon that could inflict incredible damage on the enemy, the new German Wunderwaffe, wonder weapon, called Nebelwerfer, after the German inventor Nebel. But the 6-barreled rocket launchers came too late to win this battle for us. Following the railway track and ducking for cover at the least sound, I carried the usual gear: rifle, sidearm, water canteen, and first aid kit. My stomach rumbled. We had eaten the last of our food the night before. Despite my hunger, fatigue, sore body, and aching feet, my youthful energy carried me to the front of the line. Darkness fell, accompanied by the now familiar chill of these desert regions. We trudged for hours through the night. Near dawn, we spotted one of our German anti-aircraft units hastily burning papers and destroying anything that might benefit the enemy. Limping severely by then, I hobbled up to a couple of the younger soldiers to satisfy my curiosity. Turned out they had drawn the same conclusion we had and were also headed for the coast. They took pity on my sore feet and offered to give me a ride on their half-track anti-aircraft personnel carrier. Hastily, I looked around for Klaus, shouting for him to join me, while my new buddies hoisted me aboard. He spotted me and understood immediately. So did everyone else. Klaus gave chase, but others overtook him and scrambled aboard. As he faded into a dot in the distance, I wondered if I'd ever see Klaus again. From there, our small band merged with a huge gathering of Axis units and stragglers, ending up somewhere on the Cape Bon Peninsula. Thousands of men swarmed together. Like a river of humanity, we flowed to the coast. Near the shoreline, our forces had stored an enormous amount of food and munitions, including goodies that had never gotten back to us in the field. News of the stash rippled through the river of men like eddies in whitewater currents, stirring up discontent and disillusionment. Obviously, while we were eating cold rations, the rear echelons had been eating well. Much to my relief, Klaus caught up with me shortly after the transport stopped at the edge of the stockpile. Like a couple of kids, we ran around the pile of supplies, finding choice cans of meat and vegetables. Using my trusty Army-issue can opener, I pried open a can of sardines and shook the entire contents into my mouth, letting the oil dribble down my face. With great whoops of delight, Klaus opened up case after case of chocolate and alcoholic beverages. I gorged myself on canned beef, peas, and chocolate while I wondered what would happen next. I looked fondly at the sea. It sparkled invitingly. "I'm sure General von Arnim has boats and planes waiting for us," I told Klaus. "The signal for our rescue is probably already out." "Yeah," he said, "and my name is Trudy, and I'm vacationing on the sunny shores of the Mediterranean." He settled back, cradling a bottle in his arms. The truth was that guys like Klaus and I never knew anything. Only the officers knew what was going on, not lowly soldiers like us. I never knew the exact location of the engagements I was involved in during my short participation in the Africa campaign. Later, I discovered that American servicemen on my grunt level never knew where they were either. Well-disciplined and totally obedient, most soldiers, regardless of allegiance, had confidence in their officers. We were no different. Cogs in a war machine, we clicked along with the Axis plans and schedules. My curiosity about German strategy in the Africa campaign was not satisfied until I researched it many years later. When my replacement unit had arrived 6 months before to join the motorized infantry regiment, the 47th Panzer Grenadiers, the commander congratulated all of us on becoming a part of the 22nd Panzer Grenadier Division, formerly the 22nd Infantry Division motorized. This division, stationed on the island of Crete, Greece, only had my regiment as part of the Africa campaign. This regiment was not deployed until early 1943 in Tunisia. The commander, Colonel Bursa, was under Corps Group Weber, in the campaign between February and March of 1943, and again in the final German offensive in northern Tunisia with Corps Gruppe Weber in May of 1943. Originally, my regiment had been formed from men in northern Germany, including my state, Schleswig-Holstein, and also Hamburg and Lower Saxony. Now my regiment had done its duty against the Allied offensive and had suffered accordingly. I look back and see myself squatted among opened cans of food, doggedly stuffing another bite down, a tired, edgy private with dark blonde hair in need of cutting, wearing the same smelly, dirty uniform I had worn for 3 weeks. When we fled along the tracks to escape the enemy breathing down our necks, I felt empty and confused. I couldn't understand that after months of knocking myself out to keep up with unseen plans and unpredictable schedules, I was suddenly swept up in an unthinkable, unorganized mass retreat. My mind couldn't grasp what would happen in the next minute, let alone in the more distant future. Word got around that evening that surrender was being negotiated for the next day. Each man who repeated it looked as if the wind had been knocked out of him. "This is the end of us," Klaus whispered to me. "At least we don't have to fight anymore," I answered. "Don't worry," said some idiot, obviously not on top of things. "Germany is going to win, and we'll all be heroes." At that point, it seemed impossible to me that Germany could fight on for several more years. But Hitler wasn't ready to give up, not by a long shot. Quick as a lightning strike, an officer brought us to attention. Orders rang out. All weapons, vehicles, and anything else useful to the enemy must be destroyed immediately. My heart sank. This could only mean that there would be no rescue. We faced imminent capture. Fireworks of our destroyed armaments lit up the sky. The air thickened with the fumes of sulphur and cordite. Hands shaking, I felt around, and in one of the flashes of light, I found my rifle. I knocked it against a tree and broke the stock. Defenseless for the first time since hitting Africa, I sank down and leaned back against a tree. The tension from that last order ebbed away. Uncertainty took its place. Men's voices echoed across the silence of a night lit by bonfires of burning weapons. Comments and ideas about our strange situation were tossed back and forth. I listened, trying to make sense of it. When we had landed, we were convinced that we were the best trained, best led, best equipped soldiers in Africa. What went wrong? Terrifying scenarios of what would happen to us as POWs were a common theme. Soldiers old enough to remember World War I compared that war to this one. Men speculated all night, sounding sad and depressed or discouraged and confused. surges of anger rose to the surface. With typical adolescent scorn, I thought they had it all wrong. We'd been through hell already. How much worse could it get? I was one ex-soldier grateful to God to be alive. Later on, I learned that a two-pronged Allied offensive led to the surrender of not just my unit, but also the entire Deutsches Afrika Korps, DAK. The DAK, under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had been engaged in Libya under Italian command against British forces. Then Armee Gruppe Afrika formed to counter the invasion of American and British forces in Morocco and Algeria. Rommel joined Colonel General Jürgen von Arnim to pit their two armies against the Allies in Tunisia. The Allies had air supremacy and an overwhelming supply of vehicles, ammunition, food and fuel. They simply overpowered the Axis armies. Now we, the Axis soldiers, had no choice but to wait for dawn and for the inevitable. Shortly after daylight, with the last of the fires smouldering their goodbyes in the Tunisian sky, the commander of the DAK sent a last message to German headquarters in Italy, Air Marshal Kesselring, and the Supreme Command of the Army. All ammunition expended, arms and equipment destroyed. In accordance with orders received, the German Afrika Korps has fought itself to the condition where it can fight no more. The German Afrika Korps must rise again. Heya Safari. Drive ahead, Bantu. Kramer, General Commandant, May 12, 1943. In one fell swoop, General Kramer surrendered the entire remnant of the Afrika Korps and the Armee Gruppe Afrika, a total of more than 100,000 men, to the Allied command. I didn't hear about the speech of surrender until much later. Despite the talk among many of our soldiers about the promise of a German victory, at the time all we knew was that our battles were over. At Cape Bon, the Allies surrounded us. We heard them coming. Our non-commissioned officers organised the men. Our sergeant shouted, "On your feet! Get into parade formation! If you've still got weapons, get rid of them first. They'll shoot you if you have a weapon." From the dunes around us, the roar of American all-terrain vehicles closed in on all three sides. Weapons trained on us. Loudspeakers blared, in poor German, "Put down your weapons! Put your hands on your head! No talking! Stay right where you are!" I did exactly as I was told. Klaus stood next to me and did the same. Weapons raised, fingers on the triggers, the enemy came into our midst. The sharp, acrid stench of sweat mixed with fear rose from the ranks of our brave but unarmed soldiers. For the first time, I saw an American up close. Amazingly, he looked much like Klaus. They could have been brothers. I didn't know what to expect when a GI approached me with his gun drawn. Another surge of adrenaline made my heart pound so hard I could hear it. My fight-or-flight mechanism went cuckoo. It was all I could do to hold still and to not defend myself. I knew instinctively that this was my most dangerous moment as a captive. One false move and I would be shot. The guard patted me down for weapons and motioned me toward a line of enlisted men. After the search, I felt numb. Time stood still. Everything close seemed to be happening far away. Visions of my mother and my home appeared before my eyes and vanished. I kept my mouth shut. We were told to remain silent, presumably to keep us from organising against our captors. I doubt that anyone considered it. Then an American NCO yelled, "Speed it up! Move those krauts out on the double!" The Americans immediately put the remaining 4 S's of the Geneva Convention, Article 2, into effect. After searching for weapons, they segregated us by nationality and rank. We were safeguarded from mistreatment by our captors, silenced and sped to the rear. They organised us into formations of approximately 100 for the march into captivity, to a camp near Tunis. My formation took up at a fast clip. Unaccountably, I suddenly had to sit down. Once I did, I struggled to get up again. I couldn't stay there. For all I knew, my captors shot stragglers. I was not about to find out. I can only assume that up until then the adrenaline of the battle and survival had numbed me. Now, in the relative safety of captivity, every raw muscle and nerve ached and throbbed, from the inflamed, bleeding shrapnel wounds on my back to my swollen, bleeding feet, which looked like raw meat. The last few weeks of forced duty in the infantry had taken their toll. Even my scalp hurt from wearing my helmet for what seemed forever. The May sun, glaring in the African sky, burned my skin. I hobbled along like an old man, feeling feverish and dizzy. Klaus, shuffling along, muttered, "I feel too sick to walk much farther. I'm afraid I might have dysentery." A bedraggled soldier behind me whispered in passing, "Don't try so hard. The Americans have lots of trucks." On the verge of collapsing, Klaus plopped down on the side of the road. I joined him. I just didn't care anymore. An US Army truck lumbered up, and a guy leaned out, shouting, "Hey, Krauts, want a ride?" "Yes, please, thank you," I said in English, amazed that I had responded so politely to someone I would have had to try to kill the day before. I helped Klaus to his feet. We crawled up into the back of the open-bed truck. Soon, from my vantage point, I got a good view of what was in store for us. A makeshift prisoner of war, POW compound, had been hastily erected with concertina wire. On the level coastal plain, giant loops of barbed wire spiraled, encircling an area big enough to contain thousands of men. Once inside the wire, Klaus and I limped toward the German NCOs, who shouted orders, attempting to organize the men. In addition to the thousands the Allies had rounded up, thousands of other Axis soldiers had run out of gas and ammunition and poured in on their own volition. POWs pedalled up on bicycles. Soldiers who still had gas for their trucks waved white flags as they drove into the barricade. Hundreds of thousands of German and Italian soldiers eventually filled the compound. Ragged cheers went up when US Army trucks dumped cases of US Crashions and water in jerry cans over the wire. The term jerry can seemed comical to us. The 20-litre cans had originally been manufactured in Germany to store water and gasoline. The British copied the cans and called the cans what they called the Germans who produced them, jerrys. The Americans called the cans jerrys, but they called us krauts, from sauerkraut, our name for preserved cabbage. At that point we couldn't be picky about what we were called. As cheers about the food grew closer, I struggled to my feet once more. I couldn't push my way through the crowd. I was too worn out to wrestle for my share. Food and water were on everyone's mind, and the strongest and fittest got it all. Klaus and I had to wait for scraps. Months later, in a POW camp in Hearne, Texas, I saw a picture in Life magazine of that makeshift prisoner-of-war camp near the African coast, with the caustic caption, "Supermen, the morning after." Talk about putting salt in the wounds. By nightfall, sarcastic German banter began afresh as we listened to the news. Some men still had radios and turned them up for the rest of us. The newscast glorified the Afrika Korps while we sat in total defeat behind barbed wire. "Are they crazy?" Klaus said. "How long does it take for them to get the message? Let me tell it. News bulletin. The Afrika Korps were winning in Tunisia, but quit when they ran out of ammunition and gas." Youth has its upside. I, for one, thought things could be worse. "At least the rains have stopped," I pointed out, always the optimist. "Otherwise, we'd be lying in cold mud up to our eyeballs." "Yeah, but when it was cold, the darned black flies weren't here to bite us," said Klaus. "Hey, you heroes, listen to this," said a guy with a radio. He turned it up louder. "Our soldiers," the German broadcaster proclaimed, "defended their positions with bare bayonets after they ran out of ammunition." "Oh, really? With my bare bayonet, I attacked a can of peas," I joked to Klaus. In between making caustic remarks about our so-called heroic deeds, Klaus started talking seriously about our future. The older men gravely told us, "The Allies' next move will be to send us to permanent POW camps in other countries." Boyishly exuberant and naive, I got excited over the prospect of leaving Africa. I'd had enough of the Dark Continent. My expectations of serving in the highly touted Africa campaign had been destroyed like the tanks we left behind. I couldn't let myself think about the fallen buddies I had helped bury. Why did this happen? How did we fail? I couldn't help but think about events that had thrust me into this situation. Throughout most of my young life, the Nazis had glamorized war in films and songs. Hitler's speeches convinced most of us that winning glory for the fatherland was our ultimate goal. I was drafted into the German army at Ratzeburg. With the invincibility of youth, I said my first goodbye. My relatives, neighbours and friends threw a farewell party for me and tried to be cheerful and supportive. They followed me to the train station. "Tschüss! Tschüss!" they cried, waving hankies. My father, a World War I veteran, cautioned me, "Pay attention, don't let your mind wander for 1 second, and don't volunteer for anything." My uncle Hani was an intellectual who had always cautioned me about the Nazis. He said in a quavering whisper, "Don't talk about anything controversial." My mother, whom I loved with all my heart, said, "I will pray for you every night and write to you every week." I held back tears. At least we knew where I was headed. My unit was assigned to Tonda, Denmark. My mother had been born in that area. Prized for its superior agriculture, it had been fought over like a prize for years. My father thought my basic training assignment ironic. He answered my first letter with a joke. "Now you are a German soldier, occupying your mother's homeland." I came from a family of history buffs. My father and Uncle Hani reminded me that this area had reverted back to Denmark after the League of Nations, the forerunner of the Witte United Nations plebiscite in 1920. Schleswig-Holstein had bounced back and forth like a tennis ball, Danish rule, given up to Austria and Prussia after the War of 1848, shared until Prussia defeated Austria in 1864, then declared a Prussian province with Schleswig as capital. Now, in the most recent match, German forces had invaded Denmark 2 years before without a fight. By the time I got there, we were sharing barracks with Danish armed forces and saluting their officers. The official German line was that we were there for the protection of Denmark. However, we soon learned that the Danes were not threatened by anyone but us. Basic training really did coincide with occupation duty. When I first entered the military, I thought I would like the adventure, but I soon discovered that the Army's perfectionism over uniforms, boots, beds, lockers and shaving techniques aggravated me. Training bored me. Standing guard at night in a little wooden hut annoyed me. Even though I knew that a British commando could sneak up, I fell asleep on my feet every time I had guard duty and woke up with a jerk when my rifle clattered against the boards. At my best, I was just an average grunt. Our outfit was moved to several cities, probably to give the Danes the impression that we had a lot more German troops there than we actually did. We were in a part of Denmark with a large German-speaking population. Although Danes called it Southern Jutland, we called it North Schleswig. Germany was clearly in control. During basic training, I made 2 new friends, Marcus and Dieter. As part of our stint in Denmark, we were given some strange duties. Night alerts rousted us out of bed to hunt down British agents dropped by parachutes. Marcus and Dieter and I would groan every time they told us British spies were out there. "If we catch a Brit, will they give us a medal?" Marcus asked the first time out. "No, but they'll probably make sure you go on every alert," Dieter said with a laugh. "I need my sleep," I whined. We were never successful in any captures. On another occasion in my training occupation duty, I was assigned to the funeral detail of a volunteer Danish Waffen-SS man killed in action in Russia. SS stood for Schutzstaffel, or Protection Unit. Germany had set up volunteer SS units in countries with populations considered Nordic or Aryan. A Northland division had been formed from Norwegian and Danish volunteers. Similar units had been formed from volunteers in the Netherlands and Belgium. For the fallen Dane, we had to do a slow goose step in the funeral parade, something not taught or practiced by draftees during wartime. The ridiculous step gave us Charlie horses that night. Ah! 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 We had to jump out of bed and hop around to relax the muscle cramps. One good thing about being stationed in Denmark was the abundance of good food. Marcus, Dieter and I could hardly believe our eyes. Coming from heavily rationed wartime Germany, we eyeballed the shops and stores full of high-quality food. On our first weekend passes, we examined the store windows deliriously as we strolled past magnificent ice cream parlours, glorious bakeries, and sparkling clean butcher shops. Lace curtains and flower boxes lured us into an ice cream shop with tiny wooden tables and chairs. "This looks wonderful. Let's go inside," I said. My friends and I hadn't had ice cream since we left home. I ordered a big dish. Marcus and Dieter did the same. "Did you see those shops? We can buy a lot of good food for our parents and send it home," Marcus said. "But I heard the rules. We can only send one parcel per man," Dieter groused. "There's got to be a way to do it," I said. "We'll think of something." We watched Danish girls and boys our age, comfortably dressed in civilian clothes. I felt twinges of envy. They didn't seem to have a care in the world. They clowned around and acted as if we weren't even there. Dressed in our German uniforms, Marcus, Dieter and I didn't fit into the peaceful setting. Each day of basic training taught us more elements of warfare, more duties, more responsibilities. From the age of 13, we were marched and drilled. I realize now that we never had the chance to have a normal adolescence. Opportunities melted away like the last drop of ice cream in my dish. "I guess the girls here don't like us," Marcus said. "I can't get a smile out of any of them." "That's not nice of them. We're here as their protectors," Dieter chimed in. "If we were dressed in our clothes from home, I bet they'd be friendlier," I said. "Hey boys, by the way, I figured out how to help feed our families back home." Our small pay in Danish kroners prevented much generosity, but I had managed to tuck some money in the German postal savings account system back home. When buddies in my unit went on leave to Germany, I had them withdraw money for me. Using my account book, they could withdraw from my account at any post office in Germany and bring the marks back to me. No one ever let me down, even though they knew it was strictly forbidden to use German marks in Denmark. My buddies understood, since they wanted to help feed their families too. Many Danes who were ethnically German accepted German marks for their goods. At 18, I didn't stop to think about the punishment for my seller or me. I paid double the regular price. I bought all the food I could with the illegal marks for my family and sent it home when someone went on leave. I finished basic training about the time America launched Operation Torch and invaded North Africa. Germany was fighting the Allies on all fronts. My drill sergeant, Hans Nielsen, took me aside for some reason and told me I should choose Africa over Russia for my tour of duty. He may have appreciated that I was cheerful and a quick worker. He may also have noticed that I was hyperactive and uncoordinated, talking all the time and bumping into things. I was the joker in any gathering of guys. My bunch got a few laughs by calling attention to my ears and nicknaming me Antenna Ears. Sergeant Nielsen, a father himself, also might have been concerned because I had been slow to mature and still looked like a little boy. The sergeant, a native of Hamburg, which was close to my home, had served in the military since the outbreak of World War II. His piercing blue eyes, straight blonde hair, and muscular physique gave him the look of an Adonis, and he was greatly admired by his troops. His confident manner was respected by every rank. He had participated in the Poland campaign, as well as the Russian winter campaign. He wore the Iron Cross, second class, and the Verwundeten Abzeichen, similar to the Purple Heart. He had also been decorated with a Russian winter campaign medal dubbed the Frozen Meat Decoration. He painted, in graphic detail, the picture of widespread frost-related injuries and amputations suffered by German soldiers poorly outfitted for the cold climate of Russia. "Eriksson, go to Africa. You'll be much better off," Sergeant Nielsen said. "But I really want to be in a motorcycle unit in Russia," I said, disappointment sticking in my throat. "You crazy kid! You don't know how lucky you were when they kicked you out of the program." His blue eyes blazed with intensity. "Lucky!" I blurted out. "It was the worst day of my life." My ignoble expulsion from the glamorized motor unit still smarted. I was mad at myself for having missed the opportunity. Thrills and adventure were guaranteed. Motorcycle drivers relayed messages over vast territories in Russia that were held by German forces. I had signed up, knowing that I qualified for training because I fit the minimum height and weight requirement. Plus, my eyesight was excellent. The same couldn't be said for my reflexes. I overreacted, overcompensated, oversteered, and crashed 2 motorcycles by hitting the wrong controls at the wrong time. My trainers gave up on me. "Sorry, kid," one of them told me. "You're too nervous." Sergeant Nielsen took me aside and tried to make me understand what was still happening to ground troops in Russia. He told me that partisans love to ambush motorcyclists by stringing hidden wires across lonely roads. I peppered him with questions. Once I got the whole story, I no longer felt bad about washing out of the training program. I accepted his wisdom and applied for Africa. When my orders came for Africa, my heart stopped in my throat. I had been assigned to an anti-tank unit. No, not another driving test. Luckily, everyone in the unit learned to drive the vehicles by practicing on a circular track until they were ready to take the test. So all I had to do was to start the vehicle and shift it into forward gears. There was no need to learn how to reverse gears and back up. When my turn came, my buddies stood by the track and shouted encouragement. "You can do it, antenna ears!" When I made the trips around the track without mishap, I was elated. I proudly joined the others who passed and got my war driver's license. The next step in qualifying for the Africa Corps was to pass the physical, a tropical fitness examination. The standards were severe. You had to be physically strong and in perfect health. Your vital signs, such as blood pressure, heart rate, circulation, and muscle tone, had to be perfect. Your hearing and eyesight had to be at least average, but preferably above. You could not have any chronic medical conditions. I was happy when I heard I had passed the exam. A sergeant told me to await orders to proceed to the medieval northern German city Lübeck, to a camp where we would be outfitted for Africa. Lübeck was a favourite place of mine, with its fanciful town gate and landscaped parks. But by the time I got there, the city of my memories was in tatters. Much of it was destroyed by fierce British air raids. Yet life went on there, as it did elsewhere in bombed-out German cities. My name was on the roster of soldiers to be shipped out to Africa, but I had 2 weeks before we were scheduled to deploy. After being cooped up in Denmark, I needed fun and excitement. On our first day in camp, I looked around for thrills. Our sergeant outfitted us with uniforms and equipment. He showed us to the barracks and told us that a whistle would sound at mealtimes. The whistle also blew for drills and duties every day. Our sergeant ended his remarks when he said, "You will get weekend passes to Lübeck for good behaviour. Now, let me make my next rule very clear. You must not wear the Africa Corps uniform until I tell you to. You will put it on the day you leave for North Africa." I gathered from that little speech that British spies were not supposed to know when our platoon of replacements would land. How overly suspicious, I thought. Where in the world could a spy hide in Germany? As soon as we got inside our barracks, Marcus, Dieter and I started laughing. They were treating us like men instead of boys for a change. I tried on my new uniform. It made me believe that I actually belonged to the exotic Africa Corps. We threw coats over our uniforms and sneaked into the washroom to get a glimpse of ourselves in the mirror. We didn't see our smooth baby faces. We just saw the uniforms. Boy, did we look intriguing. If this didn't impress the girls, what would? "I'm sick of all this marching and drilling," I blurted out. "What do you say we head for town?" Dieter whispered. "You can't do that. You don't have a pass." "What's the worst that can happen to us?" Marcus asked. "The stockade, you idiot," Dieter hissed. He brought out the daredevil in me. "I'm going to town, and I'm going to wear my new Africa Corps uniform." I put it on and buttoned my regulation army greatcoat over it. "So am I," Marcus said as he hastily fastened the belt. I turned around and saw a few other guys in our barracks doing the same thing. Dieter was such an old lady. When the dinner whistle blew, we joined what appeared to be a small expedition to Lübeck. We jumped out the windows, slurped down the so-called dinner, backed away, and ran for the streetcar. Once we got to Lübeck, we paid for another, better meal. The meals couldn't come close to the quality in Denmark, but at least we were full and we got out of drills and duties. Marcus and I took off our coats and tried to show off for the girls. They were definitely unimpressed. Obviously, we weren't the first boys to sneak into town wearing Africa Corps uniforms. Since girlfriends were out of the question, we went stag to movies and concerts and sneaked back to the barracks in the dark. I got by with these pranks so easily that I was convinced I could get by with anything. My home in Kiel was only 49 miles away from Lübeck. I knew I wouldn't get a pass for that distance, even if I asked for it. Impulsively, I told Marcus that I was going home. He had the same idea. "Let's not tell Dieter. He'd never try it, but he'll figure out where we've gone," Marcus said. "I have to tell Dieter," I protested. "Someone has to call me when we get orders to ship out to Africa." I could almost smell my mother's cooking. I rented a bicycle and pedalled the 49 miles, which included the towns of Plon and Eutin, to Kiel by the sea. About half of the distance from Plon to Eutin is known as the Holstein, Switzerland, because of its hills. After about 25 kilometres of pedalling uphill and then holding tight as I coasted downhill, I began to have second thoughts. I was getting sore and tired, but by now I was AWOL. "At least I'm not on a train or bus," I told myself. German military police would have found me for sure. They were known as chain dogs because they each wore a chain around their necks, with a metal shield in front on their chests. Although the jokes about the chain dogs among sarcastic German army men were hilarious, having them in your face was not. As I pumped up the hills and coasted down, I flip-flopped between terror about getting caught and the excitement of being home with my family. I didn't even know where they were living. Since I had never seen their apartment, I tried to picture where their building was located. Average Germans during that era didn't have telephones. You had to place a call where you knew they would send a messenger and vice versa. Through letters, I knew that my family had found an apartment near the harbour so that they could finally leave the suburban cottage they shared with another family. Although I was happy that they could finally have some privacy, I was worried. They were in even more danger of being bombed than they had been in our old apartment, because the new one was across the street from one of the biggest shipyards in Germany. That was probably the reason why they were able to get the apartment assigned to them. It overlooked the harbour. The cool Baltic breeze and the tangy smell of salt air soothed me as I coasted down their block. I found their apartment easily. It was one of the few left standing. Exhausted and sweaty, I was quite proud of myself when I rang their doorbell. When my father answered, his blue eyes widened with surprise at seeing me. When he learned that I was not on leave, I thought he'd have a stroke. "Are you crazy?" he hissed through clenched teeth. His eyes now blazed blue flashes. A policeman, as well as an ex-soldier, he recognized the seriousness of the situation. "Do you realize what you've done?" "What's the problem?" I snapped back. I had left as a boy of 18, only to return after a few months as, well, a man of 18. My father wanted to conceal me in the cellar. He knew my AWOL status would cause shockwaves in our entire apartment building. After all, I was the son of a respected law officer. "I left a telephone number with one of my buddies back in Lübeck in case anything comes up," I explained hastily. I tried to assure him I wasn't the only one taking unofficial leave. My buddy Wiz went home to Poland. My family seemed terribly uncomfortable and acted strange around me. Looking back, I realize how hard it must have been for them. They had already said goodbye and adjusted to my absence. Now they would have to go through it again. We were a subdued lot as my family went about their usual tasks, and I helped my mother around the house. She was already making trades and purchases for Christmas meals and gifts. I caught my father looking at me several times before he covered up his sentiments by launching into more advice about doing the right thing at the right time. He was bold, brash, a man's man. As a parent, he was strict. I always knew that he considered me a sissy. He knew better than anyone that I was a reluctant soldier. He emphasized that I was an adult and that I must stop acting like a child. He told me again about his own exemplary behavior as a soldier in World War I. I listened with half an ear. Yeah, I thought, that was you, but I'm not you. I lit a cigarette for the first time in front of my father. I tipped back in my chair, blew out a puff of smoke, and said, "I made it through basic training, didn't I? I'll be okay." "God in heaven!" my father exploded. "The boy doesn't know a thing," he complained to my mother, talking about me as if I wasn't there. The boy won't listen to me. Heine, please listen to your father, Mother pleaded in her sweet voice, as she always did. My father was a tough man with dogged determination, his emotions kept deep inside. Whether he inherited these personality traits, or whether World War I made him that way, I will never know. I do know that I found myself taking on his characteristics more and more as I became a soldier, and then, later, as a prisoner. Perhaps they even saved my life. After about a week at home, Dieter called and I got his message. We're leaving tomorrow. You better get back on the double. I felt a tug at my heart. When would my family and I see one another again? My parents probably wondered if, not when, they would ever see me. Mother hugged me tightly, hiding her tears unsuccessfully behind my back. Have a safe journey, dear Heine. Write us when you get to your new post. My Uncle Hani had lived with us for as long as I could remember. A tender, reclusive soul, he couldn't stand to go through the goodbyes again. He stayed in his room. My father, who knew far more than my mother about the battles to come, stood as tall as his 5'5" height allowed and barked, Heino, you will come back to us, son, and don't you dare get arrested on the way back. If I had a car and a driver, I'd take you there just to make sure you get back on time. You make me crazy with worry. You know what'll happen if you get caught. They'll put you in a penal battalion, or at the very least ship you to Russia. I realized that my impulsive act could get me in serious trouble. Although I had barely recovered from my first bike ride, I mounted the thing again and headed back fast. Dieter waited for me at the gate. After I skidded in, he briefed me. 30% of the guys missed roll call. They noticed that you weren't here either. You have to report to the captain. That figured. Still, I was relieved, because I knew that the captain was a gentle, elderly World War I veteran. I hobbled into his office and stood in line with all of the other AWOLs. When my turn came, I saluted, introduced myself, and stood stiffly at attention with my pot, my steel helmet, on my head. The captain's faded blue eyes looked at me under a wrinkled brow. You have broken a code of honor. You have let your unit down. What would have happened if this base had been attacked? I hung my head and tried to look ashamed. I'm truly sorry, sir. It's just that my family is so close that I couldn't let the opportunity to see them once more slip by. He clucked his tongue in sympathy, letting me know where he really stood. Since you're shipping out tomorrow, nothing more will come of this. Thank you, sir, I said as I saluted, turned on my heel and exited. Saddle sore and weary, I lurched over to my unit. The guys were packing up their military gear and heading out. I threw my stuff together and ran after them. Come on, antenna ears, hurry! They shouted. I couldn't keep up. My legs were buckling. Man, you're weak. What's the matter? Couldn't pedal over a couple of hills? Marcus laughed as he pulled me along. Dieter boosted me into the railway car. We travelled the typical German way, in the freight cars of trains. Each car had bunks installed and a stove in the centre. Heaps of straw made the floors more comfortable for sitting. We made it aboard just before the train pulled out. I looked down the track and saw my buddy from Poland running behind as fast as he could go. Hey, look! I shouted. Wiz from Poland made it too. Wiz burst into an Olympic sprint. Come on, we shouted as he rushed along the track. I've got him, I yelled, and several of us pulled him aboard. We sat on the floor, winded, and watched our homeland flash by. We were a bunch of baby-faced teenagers, trained and supposedly battle-ready. Typical soldiers. From that time on, we never knew where we were going, where we were when we got there, or how long we would stay. My family's favourite holiday, Christmas, was coming up, and I didn't know how I would spend it. I already missed my family. The long train ride took us via central Germany, Bavaria and Tyrol, former Austria, now the Ostmark, and through the Brenner Pass, the border between Germany and Italy. We left the doors open during the day to watch the scenery rolling by. We couldn't wait to see Italy, our glorious fascist ally, even though we shivered and our stomachs rumbled most of the time. Provisions on the trip were cold rations and an occasional cup of hot coffee served by Red Cross workers in the cities. Cold rations were canned bread with cheese or meat for making a sandwich. We looked forward to the great steaming cauldrons of meat and vegetable stews that were served to the military in some of the railroad stations. We never knew how long we would sit in a station, because replacement troop transports were secondary to other military needs, supply trains going south and trains with wounded going north. When we got to Rome, my adventurous spirit emerged. From my perch on the train, I could see St. Peter's Dome over the rooftops. Now there was something to be explored, and here I was, stuck on the train. As we were leaving, our sergeant gave us transport numbers in case the train suddenly started up and left us behind. Should that happen, our orders were to board any southbound Italian train. It didn't take me long to realize that I could use the transport numbers as excursion tickets. When we stopped in Naples one night, my reckless spirit emerged. Before me, a fabulous city stretched out invisibly, like a hidden treasure. "Come on, guys," I said, trying to coax Marcus and Dieter. "Let's go see this place. We've got the lira." Italian lira were doled out when we entered Italy. When I explained that this would be the only place we could spend the money burning in our pockets, the two agreed to the adventure. We didn't speak the language or know the town, which was in total blackout. I knew it would be difficult to find our way around. Fortunately, we had all developed cat's eyes from years of blackouts in Germany. Blackouts were customary in all warring countries due to air attacks. A little too cocky, I went too fast for my own good. I tripped over objects and fell down several times while my buddies laughed at me. "Do you really know where you're going, antenna ears?" Dieter jeered. Then I heard the clink of glasses and the unmistakable scent of wine and peanuts, and spotted an outdoor tavern. "See, I knew I'd find something," I said as I peered through the darkness for a place to sit. "Yeah, antenna ears, you did it," Dieter had to admit. He eased himself onto a bar stool. In the light of a small candle, I could see the Italians, our allies, give us friendly nods. For the first time in weeks, we felt free and relaxed, eating peanuts and drinking Chianti wine. We had hoped to see some girls. But in those days, proper young ladies were not allowed to socialize in such places. After many hours of Gemütlichkeit with the Italians, we gave in to our habit of duty and stumbled back to our train, still standing in the station. We smirked over our little adventure and the fact that we hadn't gotten caught. The train started up soon enough, taking us the rest of the way, to Reggio de Calabria, at the boot of Italy. When we jumped off the train, we herded into what looked like a POW camp surrounded by a high-wire fence. "What's going on?" I muttered. My buddies and I tried to find someone in charge. "These are your temporary quarters on the way to Africa," our sergeant explained. "They're under tight security." "What's the reason for this?" I asked. "You'll see." We saw why that night. Our camp was sleepy by day and a beehive of activity in the evening when the Italians came with wine and money to barter or to pay for parts of our uniforms. Our tropical uniform consisted of khaki green cotton garments, 2 pairs of long trousers, one of which was a pair of jodhpurs, riding pants, and a pair of shorts, 3 long-sleeved shirts, underwear and socks. Our tropical footwear was made of canvas and leather, knee-high laced boots to wear with our jodhpurs, and a pair of ankle-high boots. We also had woolen items for chilly desert nights, a sweater, an overcoat, and wool gloves. Each of us wore webbed canvas belts with a brotbeutel, a carrier to hold a day's supply of rations. A sidearm, 2 water bottles, a steel helmet, a pith helmet, a visored cap, and a K98 carbine were also part of the outfit. Our total gear included a rucksack with a blanket and a special poncho, which could be snapped into a tent with the ponchos of 4 other men. A gas mask, sun and dust goggles, a dust scarf, and a mess kit completed the outfit. Fully outfitted with this gear, we looked like rich tourists. The typical Italian soldier had only one uniform, made of wool and usually missing buttons. Some soldiers didn't even have bootlaces. They haggled through the fence every night for our gear, unsuccessfully. The Italians didn't realize that we needed everything we had. We didn't know if we could ever get resupplied, and besides, we were held accountable for our uniforms and equipment. A week or so later, trucks took us to an airfield where Ju-52 Junker transport planes waited for our flight to Tunis, North Africa. The German Air Force never had air superiority in this theatre of war, since we depended on our Italian allies for air and naval support. Our sergeant shouted for attention. He was the first of many that I had during my stint in the Africa Corps. Enlisted men like me were shuffled around from place to place and from sergeant to sergeant like cards in a poker game. This NCO had the responsibility of getting us to the airfield in Tunis in one piece. "Planes and gliders will join us from Sicily! Get ready for the ride of your life!" he shouted. German Junkers revved up their motors. Inside, 50 of us huddled on the floor with our gear. For most of us, this was our first flight. My stomach was doing flip-flops. I heard huge propellers growl as they lifted their loads off the ground, then settle into a whine as they flew low over the Mediterranean. Manned machine guns thrust out of windows protected our convoy. The sergeant said, "Listen up. We expect attacks by British planes from Malta at the airport at Tunis. When we land, grab your gear and exit the runway as fast as you can go. And I mean quick. Got it?" We came in bumping hard on an airfield full of craters that had been hastily filled in. I grabbed my gear, said a prayer and jumped. Just as predicted, British Spitfires shot at us as we ducked off the runway toward cover. Our planes took off as soon as the last man flung himself out. No one got hit, but our hearts were pounding triple time. "Man, I didn't think we'd get shot at the second we got here," Dieter said. "Well, we're in Africa, and we're in the Corps, so I guess we can expect more of the same from now on," I said. That gem of wisdom must have come from my father. Trucks waited outside the airfield to take us to Kairouan, Tunisia, the fourth holiest city of Islam. This was a place I had heard about. The low, flat-roofed buildings matched the colour of the earth. A brilliant blue sky cast deep shadows. Africa was a far different world than mine in every respect. The first natives I encountered looked completely different from the average German burgher. Bright red fezzes covered the heads of many Muslim men. Black cloth draped the women from the tops of their heads to their toes. They carried market baskets as they walked behind their men. Why are they so covered up and quiet? I wondered. They were quite a contrast to our women, who had taken male occupations when our able-bodied men had been sent off to war. The most noticeable women on German streets were our bossy female streetcar conductors. In this exotic setting and culture, we youngsters were readied for battle. At Kairouan, we stayed in a camp of tents. At least the tents weren't enclosed in barbed wire. After our officers organised us into military units for action, we were given a lot of leisure time. In the event that we might mingle with the local population, we were given instructions on how to behave with Muslims. Tunisia was still a reluctant French colony and friendly to Germans. The natives treated us with respect and considered us their liberators from France. We were told that if we went to a Muslim home, we must knock and immediately turn our backs, since an unveiled woman might answer the door, and that we must remove our shoes if invited inside a home or a mosque. I hoped to be invited to a Tunisian home to try out my new knowledge. Marcus and Dieter, on the other hand, quickly got bored with the city. But I liked to find my way around in foreign cities, figure out the exchange rate, and try to speak the language. My entertainment was going to the Kasbah, heady with strange sounds, smells, and flavours. Spices, olives, grapes, and citrus fruits were grown in the area and haggled over at this market. I craved oranges and soon befriended an orange seller, a few years older than I, named Amir. While we did not share a language, I used my sheet with Arabic words to communicate with him. One day he invited me to dinner in his home. His little house was typical, built of mud bricks and whitewashed. I pointed to my boots. "Do I have to take them off?" I asked. Amir wagged his finger in a no sign. The aromas coming from a corner of a room that was the kitchen made my mouth water. We sat on oriental carpets and ate from a low table set with platters of couscous, pita, vegetables, and a jug of hot sauce for dipping. I watched him eat without silverware, using only his right hand, before I followed suit. We sipped strong Arabian coffee, As I expected, his wife did not eat with us. While we were dining, I asked if he could show me his mosque, which dominated the walled city. He agreed to take me when there was no religious service. Since my arrival, I had heard the call of the muezzins from the nearby mosque calling their faithful to prayer 5 times a day. I saw men stop what they were doing to get out their prayer rugs and kneel before God. I was curious to see the inside of the famous mosque. What was different? Would the answer to what made them act so religious be inside, I wondered. Although Christian, a baptized and confirmed Lutheran, I did not feel as closely connected to my church as I had as a child. Religious observations were discouraged under Hitler's rule. My parents told me they felt torn and confused about the absence of religion in their lives. I knew little of the other 2 major religions, Judaism and Islam. Now here was something to write home about. After dinner, Amir and I approached the enormous mosque. It rose high above the flat-roofed mud houses. A tower on its roof overlooked the city. "Do I have to take my boots off?" I asked Amir once again, pointing to my feet. He clicked his tongue several times in admonishment that I would have to even ask. He motioned me to take them off. Leaving my irreplaceable boots outside was a leap of faith. I tried to keep an eye on them while I marvelled over the interior of the mosque, vastly different from my home church in Kiel, Germany. Open to the outdoors, the mosque's most remarkable features were its brightness and its columns arranged in rows in an interior devoid of benches and chairs. Amir pointed to the wall ahead of us and said, "Mecca." I understood that the wall we stood before faced Mecca. The enormous room was divided by a grille into male and female sections and decorated with brightly painted mosaic tiles. Amir gave me a privileged glimpse into Islam. I had forgotten about my boots. I hurried back outside. My boots must have attracted attention, but they were still there. Since I had shown so much interest in his mosque, Amir tried to tell me about the Prophet Muhammad. After many attempts at words and pantomimes, I grasped the concept of the Hijra, understanding that it was the Prophet's forced journey from Mecca to a more congenial place. I wished that I had the words to describe my Lutheran church at home to this Muslim. Despite the social reaction to religion as a whole and my family's confusion, I had always been comforted by my personal faith. It gave me words to cling to as war swirled about me. Little did I know that I would soon be on my own Hijra, my own forced journey. The next day, Marcus and Dieter and I shook hands as we parted company. I was assigned to an anti-tank unit that moved to a military front somewhere around Spitler or Kasserine. Many fronts dotted the long, jagged attack and defence line. I was curious to see what a front actually looked like. I didn't know whether I felt relieved or disappointed when all I saw was more of the same desert. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's placement of my unit was a small part of a complicated plan to drive the Allies out of Tunisia. Rommel had withdrawn 1,400 miles across Egypt and Libya to arrive in Tunisia at the Mareth Line in January 1943. In February, he linked up with Colonel General Jürgen von Arnim of the 5th Panzer Army, which Hitler had rushed to Tunisia after America's Operation Torch landings. "The armour is the core of the motorized army," Rommel declared. "Everything turns on it." Certainly the Desert Fox based his entire campaign on this premise. The desert itself, with its flat, open terrain, provided the setting for armoured warfare in a classic form. The result was a technology race to see which nation could equip its armies with tanks that would outshoot, outmaneuver, and outlast their foes. The tanks ranged from speedy light models for reconnaissance to heavily armoured types for assaults on fortified positions. The Americans had Sherman tanks, which could reach speeds of 25 miles an hour, and had 75 mm guns in a power-driven turret. They also had Grant tanks, which were bigger and had 37 mm and 75 mm guns, but a design flaw hampered the larger weapon. We had Panzers. The Panzer III was speedy and manoeuvrable and carried a 50 mm gun. Panzer IVs, Tiger tanks, took on machine gun nests, tanks, infantry and anti-tank guns, with a 75mm turret gun. By the time I got to Africa, we had the latest models, outfitted with thicker armour and with longer-barrelled, more powerful guns than before. Assembled at the front, I, along with the other enlisted men, waited for instructions. "Get out your shovels, boys," our sergeant said with a grin, "and make yourselves at home." We divided into 4-man teams and burrowed into the flat plain to protect ourselves from bullets and from the weather. We had with us our 50mm and 75mm anti-tank guns, which we towed behind open, all-terrain, tan-painted half-truck/half-tank vehicles. We made ourselves as comfortable as possible in our dugouts. A little ingenuity was called for. Waterproof gas mask canisters were just the thing to protect our cigarettes from getting wet. We grumbled that the officers had overburdened us with too much stuff to carry. We pitched out the pith helmets that gave us no protection from bullets or cold, but we were glad for our wool sweaters and gloves and our greatcoats. The temperature dropped as much as 60 degrees at night. We expected to see action, yet we neither saw nor heard signs of battle. They told us that the action was taking place in the north. Even so, danger was a constant companion on the front. The ground was littered with explosive mines. Tribes of desert nomads, called Bedouins, often appeared as they followed their long-established trading routes. Turbaned men, wrapped in robes and wearing leather boots, rode camels with colourfully woven saddle blankets. The Bedouins' women walked ahead to scout for mines. Women were obviously more expendable than camels in the minds of the Bedouins. Are they wives or slaves? I wondered. Watching the nomads pass by was a welcome diversion. Nearly 2 weeks passed as we camped out at this post alongside an Italian unit. Scruffy and as ill-clad as the soldiers we had seen in Italy, the Italians were different from us in other ways. Much more fun-loving than we Germans, they gathered together, drank wine, and sang on duty at night, probably hoping that British patrols would hear them and stay away. Our Italian comrades were not keen on standing watch alone. My buddies and I weren't keen on standing guard alone either. However, since we were known as highly disciplined Germans, we stoically went off solo to our watches in the dark desert. We hoped just as fervently that a Brit with a sharp knife wouldn't sneak up on us. The Italian soldiers had a wine ration doled out 1 litre a day per man, but it was tainted with the smell of the old gas canisters it was stored in. The Italians got hot pasta meals each day with their wine. We were given bread or dry toast, called zwieback, which was mouldy sometimes, and sausage or sardines in olive oil. Occasionally we were given a treat, a new chocolate bar laced with cola called Coca-Cola. As a beverage, we received clear water from jerry cans painted with white crosses to distinguish them from gas cans. A supposedly sanitary water supply came from wells that Germans had dug in the area. Still, men stationed in Africa for long periods became jaundiced and had sores that wouldn't heal. Some of our leaders thought the jaundice was caused by the lack of fresh fruit and vegetables. Rommel himself tried to prove that our diet was sufficient by only eating what we did. Within 2 years, army rations in Africa made him chronically ill. Nevertheless, we considered our food somewhat superior to the Italians' fare. The Italians seemed to feel the same way. They gave us sympathetic looks as they chowed down. Their cans of food were printed with the letters AM. My buddies and I thought that the labelling was hilarious. At every meal, some joker would announce, "They're eating alter man, canned old man again," and we'd laugh our heads off. Luckily, our Italian comrades didn't understand German, or we probably would have had some fistfights. In February, the rains came. The German command was caught unprepared. The cold seasonal rains transformed the desert into a sea of mud that had a brutal force of its own. Trucks and transports stopped in their tracks. Motorcycles got mired. Thick ooze nearly sucked the boots off our feet. "How are we supposed to live in this muck?" I asked my sergeant. "It could be worse," he said. "Neither side wants to risk a battle stuck in the mud. Think of this as a vacation." About all our commander could manage with such conditions was to secure chains for tyres and treads to keep from getting stuck in our own encampment. We lived, ate and slept in cold goo. Wet slime was our bedfellow. The ponchos we unsnapped into four-man tents were as muddy as our trenches. We had no way to keep clean and dry. By mid-February 1943, Field Marshal Rommel pulled my unit back from the front to become part of a preparation for a German offensive in northern Tunisia. As our armoured caravan moved toward the Atlas Mountains, the landscape changed. I got excited by the sight of colourful scenery, so different from my home on the Baltic Sea. There I was used to blue-grey waves, black and white seagulls, and weathered wooden piers. Here we passed rugged ranges of red rocks, winding rivers, cork forests, olive groves, vineyards, and rustic farms. But on one short break, I overheard our sergeant pointing out the disadvantages of the landscape I admired. "See those narrow mountain gorges? Our tanks might have to squeeze through them. Look at those hillsides covered with all that shrubbery. The enemy can conceal mortars there. Take a good look at the height of those hills. The enemy could be up there watching us right now," Sergeant said as he squinted up at a ridge. A cold chill settled along my spine as I tried to spot British scouts above us. Years later, I read that we were on our way to take part in one of Rommel's elaborate schemes to defeat the British. Our regiment, the 47th Panzer Grenadiers, became a part of Battlegruppe Busse, led by Lieutenant Colonel Busse, our commander. We were reserves against the British, who had gathered strength by pulling in their forces based in Libya. We got a taste of British fighting methods at our first skirmish. The British led their troops into the fight with the eerie whine of Scottish bagpipes, while our tough sergeant spurred us on. The ominous wheeze of the bagpipes sent jolts of adrenaline up my spine. "Man, I wish I could shut them up!" I shouted over the din. "I wish I could help you do it," the sergeant said. My buddies winced and looked grim. Poised for battle, we were as ready as teenage boys could possibly be. Our unit had been assigned anti-tank action. It took smooth teamwork to hold the ammunition, to load and to aim the anti-tank guns. Our inexperienced group of youngsters was always placed on the fringes of battles and skirmishes. We knew we had a lot to learn. I hoped we would live long enough to learn it. We did what was expected of us and listened for orders. During this skirmish and the next ones, we got a taste of the battles yet to come. We were placed so far back from the fray that we saw very little of what went on, but we heard the shooting and could tell that our guys had held their own. When we weren't on the front, we slept in tents and sometimes in abandoned farmhouses. Then we could clean the mud off our equipment and ourselves. Once clean, I could write letters to my family. Our mail, which included a German army newspaper called Die Oase, the Oasis, and an occasional meal of meat stew, was delivered to a field kitchen about 10 miles behind our lines. One of our all-terrain vehicle drivers had to wait until dark before he could drive back to the field kitchen to retrieve the food and precious mail. At night, British shelling was sporadic, in contrast to daytime, when they shelled continuously. One night, I was told to accompany an all-terrain vehicle driver named Max to pick up our food and mail. Visions of a yummy stew of beef, peas, and potatoes danced in my head. Max glared out into the sparkling clear night and was not pleased. "This is not a good night for a pickup." "Why?" I asked. I couldn't see any reason to be spooked. Even the moon seemed to cooperate by being as small as possible. "It's too quiet," Max said. "It's easier to make the field kitchen when we have a storm." "I thought that storms always made driving more risky," I said. "Not in this case," Max said. "You'll see what I mean." The desert was so quiet that our vehicle, made even noisier with chains on its treads, attracted British gunners before we had gone a mile. The British pinpointed us by sound alone. Shells exploded around us. Max stopped for a minute. What to do? Keep going? Turn around? As soon as he stepped on the gas, a shell exploded right where we had halted. God is watching us, I thought. I braced myself in my seat as Max sped full throttle to the field kitchen. We stopped only long enough to pick up individual cans of stew fastened together by threes, as well as a waterproof bag of mail. On the trip back, British gunners homed in on us again. Shells flew thick and fast. Max slammed on the brakes. "Grab the food! Get out!" Max shouted. Yeah, I got it, I yelled. Max and I grabbed the mail and as many cans as we could before throwing ourselves into a crater made by artillery shells. The mouth-watering aroma of beef gravy wafted around us as we lay in the mud with shells whistling over our heads. "When can we go back?" I shouted. "When I say so," Max yelled. We stayed put until Max thought it was safe to return and to start up the vehicle. Max had exceptional night vision. He followed a trail I couldn't see and located black ditches in the dark. Twice more, Max braked to a stop near deep holes and helped me grab all the food before we hurled ourselves with the cans into the ooze. By the time we got back and delivered the mail and the food, I wasn't hungry anymore. Our little trip into the desert was one diversion I could have done without. Once a week, another kind of diversion dropped from the sky. The Africa Post was delivered via a high-altitude drop from an Allied plane. An American-generated newspaper written in German highlighted German failures on all fronts. The Post cited unsettling statistics. 3 German soldiers have died every minute of the day since June 1941. A February issue proposed a plan of surrender. Come alone or bring other comrades. Bring your greatcoat, mess kit and shaving kit. Leave your weapon. And bring, if possible, this newspaper, which will assure free passage through English, American and French lines. My buddies and I liked the cartoons, but we didn't know if anything in the Africa Post was true. Their plan for us to surrender looked like their way of getting a better shot at us. From time to time, Allied planes dropped surrender leaflets on us. Colonel General von Arnim tells you, "Before us, the enemy, behind us, the sea. There is no way back. Your mind tells you differently. Behind the enemy, the detention camp. Behind the detention camp, the prisoner of war camp in England or America. Behind the prisoner of war camp, home, there is a way back. The dead do not go home, but the prisoner who remains alive will see home again." I kept my confusion to myself and soldiered on. Toward the end of that filthy February, my unit was attached to Corps Gruppe Weber for an attack on British and US forces at Spatler. Both sides had been waiting for the end of the rainy season. Many years later, I learned that by March 15th, Germany's Colonel General Friedrich Weber had only 6 operational tanks remaining under his command. I also learned that in a joint strategy, the Americans and the British had combined their soldiers and war materials for their offensive. A large force of American soldiers and supplies from Algeria arrived to join the British. At Spatler, the earth beneath us shook as Allied tanks fired their mighty charges. Above the battlefield, a canopy of screeching Stuka planes dive-bombed the Allies. Incoming mortars crashed amid clumps of wildflowers, white daisies and bright red poppies. Soon the blood of German men flowed red as the poppies when Allied shells hit their targets. Smoke, fire, and the smell of explosives and scorched earth assailed our nostrils. Temporarily deafened, I looked with dismay over the plain of exploding half-tracks and guns. A description of the biblical apocalypse I had read in childhood came to me. A hurricane of steel and fire stung my eyes and hurt my ears. I expected to be blasted to smithereens any minute, yet I didn't even know the object of the battle going on around me. My buddies and I looked at each other in wonder when we heard the next order. Cease firing. God is with me, I thought. The Allied fusillade had missed us. Our team sat down on the ground and shakily lit cigarettes. All around us, bleeding and dying men and boys murmured prayers or called for their mothers while medics did all they could. "Man, that was terrible," I shouted, voicing the understatement of the year. But there were no words that I knew to describe what we had just been through. "So many dead, so many dead, so many hurt," I mumbled. My head pounded and my ears rang. My team just shook their heads. "Yeah!" Looking back more than 50 years later, all I can say is, what a tragic waste of life. What an immeasurable loss of good men for their families, who still sadly recall husbands, fathers and brothers who never came home. How could Hitler and his advisers have considered them expendable? What motivated Hitler and his high-ranking advisers to keep seeking more power and more glory for themselves without giving a second thought to the boys and men they sent off to war. They didn't even know if they could keep us supplied. Later, I would confront larger issues concerning Hitler's actions. How could they disregard all the homeless, hungry women, children, and refugees? How did they think they could ever repair the infrastructure and all the devastated cities of Germany? Back then, my anti-tank team had barely enough time to gather our wits and our weapons when our sergeant said, "Pick up your gear. This regiment is moving out. We're providing field support." I figured out later that we were part of an offensive by General von Arnim that covered the area between El Ala and Fonduk. On our trek through the wooded hills toward the mountains, newly leafed-out trees provided some cover. The ground finally provided traction. We could, mercifully, set up our ponchos on some dry dirt. We had little respite before our next big fight, the Battle of Kasserine Pass. This pass was one of the few large corridors through the mountains. Although I didn't know it at the time, the battle was crucial to the enemy because the pass led to Algeria and the town of Tebessa, a vital Allied communications and supply base. Another road led to the city of Thala. With tanks and planes, Germany's Rommel pursued American troops across Tunisia to the western dorsal of the Atlas Mountains. On February 19, 1943, the Americans had to make a stand in the basin of Kasserine Pass in order to defend Tebessa. We funneled through 5 narrow passes into the basin, accompanied by shrieking Stukas. This was the first time that Axis forces faced the Americans in a major battle in Africa. Our sergeant had complete faith in Brig, General Karl Buelowius, who launched a major artillery barrage. The sergeant scoffed at the lightweight American M3 tanks he tracked through his binoculars. "They're toys compared to our panzers. They're flimsy," he said. "A panzer can destroy an M3 in just one shot." That wasn't all. Buelowius unleashed the new weapon, the Nebelwerfer. These 6-barreled rocket launchers were said to shower the enemy with fatal missiles. Yet while I heard the whoosh of our rockets screaming toward the enemy, I saw our vehicles being hit by returned fire, saw more of our boys dead and dying. By 4:30 that afternoon, the rest of our troops poured into the basin through Kasserine Pass. I expected to be blasted to kingdom come as we loaded, aimed and shot our anti-tank guns, until we heard those welcome words, "Cease firing." At the end of the battle, my buddies and I lit cigarettes, trying to calm our nerves, and waited for our ears to stop ringing. One of my buddies congratulated me with typical German sarcasm. "Well, I see you lived to fight for another day." "Yeah," I blurted out. "I like to be out of firing range whenever I can." I thank God that Allied fire missed me time and time again. I'm grateful that I was never seriously wounded and was able to recover emotionally from the sickening battles. Unlike many of my peers, I lived on to get married and to raise sons and daughters. Looking back on these bloody battles, I'm glad that none of my children had to be in combat, even though 3 of our boys were in the American Armed Forces. As for the Battle of Kasserine Pass, my last major battle, I read later that the Germans won this conflict, but bungled the rest, due to the dual command at this point by General Rommel and General von Arnim. Both of them answered to Marshal Albert Kesselring in Rome, and both messaged him about their plans. General Rommel wanted to exploit German gains by striking Tebessa. Von Arnim did not. Kesselring ended up siding with Rommel, but by then precious time had been lost. During the 2 days the commanders bickered, the Allies gathered enough strength to repel Rommel. While the generals argued, von Arnim shifted our troops, intending to strike farther north. Rommel took time out to examine captured US war material, tanks, trucks, troop carriers, and weapons. The abundance of supplies and the profusion of spare parts amazed him. By contrast, his forces were down to 1 day's ammunition and only 6 days' food. His vehicles had just enough gasoline to travel 120 miles. 3 days after the battle, Rommel flew to Germany to try to persuade Hitler to abandon North Africa entirely, and thereby save the Afrika Korps from annihilation. Predictably, Hitler refused to listen to his argument and forbade the Desert Fox to return to Tunisia. Africa will be held, the Führer snapped, and you must go on sick leave. Hitler gave command of both armies to Colonel General von Arnim. As enlisted men, we knew very little about all this. When the next issue of our German army newspaper, The Oasis, reached us, we read that Rommel had fallen ill and von Arnim had replaced him. "Move out!" shouted my sergeant. We followed his lead, back in the direction we originally came, to a defensive position west of Kairouan. In April, an enormous force of American tanks attacked us in 2 skirmishes with ferocious hails of artillery. Shells flew, mortars burst, and bullets shot everywhere at once. This time our unit was not as lucky. We couldn't move. Our half-tracks had run out of fuel. Through bursts and bangs, I saw our anti-tank guns and half-tracks explode, saw our men lying dead or injured. We kept firing until we heard the order, "Retreat!" Those of us left standing abandoned our anti-tank guns and followed our sergeant into the hills. The beauty of spring in full bloom was lost on me. I felt dazed, shocked, and exhausted. The guys around me looked the same way. The loss of our vehicles turned us into foot soldiers, the infantry. With barely enough time to catch a breath, we marched off to an offensive that I later discovered to be Medjez el Bab. My unit was still attached to Gruppe Weber. The entire group included Panzergruppe Lang, with 77 tanks, 14 of them Tigers. Weber had 3 other groups, Gruppe Eder, Gruppe Audorf, and Gruppe Schmidt, with a battalion of panzers. Other regiments joined us, Goering's parachute unit, a mountain regiment, and the reserve group that included the 2 battalions of our regiment. The entire operation made a spoiling attack on the Medjez el Bab area. My unit attempted to take another hill, called Grenadier Hill, and seemed to be succeeding, but we heard an order. "Halt the attack!" At that point, we marched up Longstop Hill, a location our side had held for 4 months. Longstop Hill, known to the natives as Jebel Amira, was about 2 miles long and about 690 metres high. Although it wasn't immediately apparent, Longstop had twin peaks of about the same height. This was an advantage for our side. Whoever held Longstop Hill commanded the valley all the way to Tunis, about 25 miles away. The next day, the Allies, preceded by wailing bagpipes, attempted to seize Longstop Hill. They attacked us over and over for the next 4 days. On the 3rd night, our beleaguered officers broke out what was left of their brandy and gave it to their troops to revive them. "Drink up," our sergeant said. "It will make you feel better." It may have relaxed my sore muscles, but the next morning I felt groggy and off balance. The battle resumed. In the midst of the Führer, I was hit in the back and knocked flat on my face. I thought I had been pierced through with bullets. I was amazed when I peeked at my chest and didn't see any blood. Klaus, my teammate, checked me over. "How bad are you hit? There's some blood on your back." "I guess I'm okay," I said. He pulled me to my feet and examined me more closely. "Good God," he said. "It looks like you've been hit by our own shrapnel." But I'm alive, I thought. God is truly good. We didn't have time for Klaus to pick out the shrapnel, so he smeared my wounds with the sulphur cream we had been slathering on cactus punctures and scorpion bites. Then he taped on some bandages. Bagpipers tooted weird hoots and howls as they dogged us. Their savage shrieks sounded as if they were almost at our feet. Blasts of ammunition annihilated more of our men. Attack followed attack. Our response weakened. Even a private could see that we had run out of ammunition. New orders were shouted, "Retreat!" We scrambled to the rear and reassembled at the foot of the Atlas Mountains. We got our next order on a hill. "Dig in." Dirt flew thick and fast as soldiers dug as deep as possible for the next onslaught. Klaus and I dug madly, deeper and deeper, throwing dirt by the shovelful in every direction. We felt the Allies breathe down our necks. Finally satisfied with our work and hunkered down, we heard the unmistakable squeaks and rumbles of tanks grow louder as they bore down on us. Like young foxes in their dens, we tried to blend in with the desert until the sounds of war died away. The British considered the conflict between themselves and their German and Italian enemies a European war fought in Africa. Then Britain's allies, the Americans, got into the fray. They landed their mighty force of American men, vehicles and supplies in North Africa to link up with the British in November of 1942. They called it Operation Torch. A captive, just 6 months after landing in Africa. Marching with groups assembled in a makeshift POW compound, we were herded like a massive cattle drive toward trucks. Once again, we would make a journey. But to where? This was of vital importance. All around me guys muttered their concern like snapping turtles in a too-full pond. "I gotta know," I mumbled. "Ask the guard," a kid named Bernard pleaded. Another guy added his encouragement. "You look harmless, antenna ears. Maybe the guards won't hurt you." At that moment I realized I didn't care. I wasn't afraid of the British anymore. I thought the enemy had already done their worst to me. What more could they do? A risk-taker by nature, I thought I might as well draw on the cultured English I had learned in school. I squeezed to the front. I addressed a guard with perfect English pronunciation and tonalities. "Where are we going?" "To the port of Tunis," he said flatly. "The sea." I quickly translated for my buddies. I couldn't believe my good fortune. For a second, I smelled the heady mixture of sweat on sunburned skin and salty sea air that had been such a part of my childhood. Being near the sea again was almost like going home. I couldn't wait to see the Mediterranean. My heart pounded with excitement. Then I refocused on the British Guard in front of me. Reality struck hard. This was no summer vacation, or even a day trip to the beach. Seaside or not, this was war. About an hour later, the transports dropped us off at the harbour. Obviously, we were going to be relocated somewhere by ship. I twisted around for a last peek at Tunis as we clambered aboard our assigned coastal freighter. "Where is this ship headed?" I boldly asked a guard on board. I wanted my friends to know that I could be relied on. "To Algiers," he said. "Man!" Totally disappointed, I told an old guy named Tillman standing next to me, "We're just going to another African country." "What did you expect?" Tillman sneered. "Spain?" German sarcasm at its finest. While fleeing, he and some others had hoped to commandeer boats at Cape Bon. If we could have made it to Spain, the Spanish would have helped them get home. The Spanish government had come out on top in a civil war that ended in 1939. They had secretly shored up their troops with the strength of German soldiers. Our guards, British soldiers, herded about 100 of us down to the hold of the ship.